Years name John tells us, I still feel the shame. He tells a story, this John does, of a time when he was visiting a friend, a young man who was in a facility for young people with severe brain injuries. And John remembers that as he went to visit his friend was agitated and rather eager to walk. And so together, the two of them walked around this place, going room to room very carefully and systematically. And at each room, his friend looked in the space intentionally and carefully, as if he was searching for someone, looking all around. They finally came to a large room, like a commons or a cafeteria. And it wasn't being used for any particular event or purpose at that time. And all that was happening in that big common room was the dutiful work of a couple of janitors, buffing the floor at the very, very far end of the room, opposite where John and his friend were standing at the door. John remembers very clearly what happened next. I saw that no one was sitting at any of the tables, he writes. And I said to the young man, my friend, there's nobody in here. Then from the other side of the room came the voice of one of the janitors. What do you mean nobody? We're not nobody. It's an understandable, if unfortunate, mistake that John made. I mean, after all, I certainly could see myself making just such a slip, knowing or presuming anyway that the friend I was with was not, in fact, looking for the janitors, and the declaration that nobody's in here serving as a convenient shorthand in a passing moment. It was no passing moment, however, that brought together Lazarus and the rich man in the story that Jesus tells in today's reading from the Gospel of Luke. At this point in Jesus' journey, he's still responding to the grumblings of some of the elite religious authorities of his time. Perhaps you'll remember from a couple of weeks ago that these folks were grumbling about Jesus because, quote, this fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. And in response, Jesus tells a series of three familiar stories about the lost being found, stories about whether the rest of us can join the celebration, a series that ends with that beloved story, that tale of the father and his two sons, the father who welcomes back his so-called prodigal son, the father who tells his other son that we had to celebrate. As we move forward in Luke, last week we heard that puzzling story about the dishonest manager, a story that pretty much no one knows what to make of it, as our guest preacher said last week. A story in which Jesus may well have even been being sarcastic and facetious even to drive home his point. We've got to let go of all of the things that we cling to. The things we cling to in order to have a substitute for actually having trust in God. And in particular, Jesus seems to really be driving at the ways in which we all cling to money as one of those things. After all, you cannot serve God and wealth, he says. He says it very plainly. And this seems to get those religious authorities a-grumbling again. Which is what leads us today to today's story. The setup, the basic outcome of the story, pretty simple. Whereas last week's story, nobody really knows what to make of it. Today's story, it's pretty plain. You've got a rich man and a poor man right next to one another. And when they each pass on from this life, their station, their fortune, their fate gets radically reversed. Poor man Lazarus gets carried by the angels to dwell at Abraham's side, an image of what we might call heaven. And the rich man goes to dwell in torment and fire in the place of the dead, an image we might today call hell. Now, if you've been around Jesus much, this message of reversal shouldn't be too surprising by this point. The last will be first, and some who are first will be last. He hath filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he hath sent away empty. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free. Hopefully, we would think by now, if you've been following Jesus around the Near East, and if you've been listening to Jesus through the testimony of the Gospel of Luke, you would have caught on to something by this point. And yet, it's a bit of a jarring story, isn't it? It's a bit of a jarring story. I mean, let's be honest. For most of us in this room today, our lot in life seems a bit closer to that of the rich man than it does to that of Lazarus. After all, hear me out here, even if you are a single person with income at the federal poverty level in this country, making $12,490 a year, $12,500 a year, that still makes you wealthier than 87% of the world's population. 87%. Ordinary citizens in North America today who would qualify as Lazaruses, at least comparatively speaking on the global scale. I'm not sure the story is just about the money, though. As I said a few moments ago, after all, it was no passing moment that brought Lazarus and the rich man together. How long do we think this rich man gazed upon poor Lazarus's diseased and probably crippled body? How long? How long had Lazarus laid at that gate, hoping to gather a few crumbs from the table? And how long did the rich man sit in his house, walk out the gate and have to step over Lazarus? How long did that go on without the rich man ever actually seeing Lazarus? How is it that such a scene happens? How can a person be so numb to the needs, the pain, the simple humanity of someone else they pass by every day, never stopping to lend a hand or provide relief or soothe the pain? Now, mind you, Jesus never says that the rich man is particularly evil. For that matter, he never tells us that the poor man, that Lazarus, is particularly good. All Jesus indicates is this disparity between the resources of these two. And so I ask, if it's not from some, predetermined moral flaw, this person is categorically evil, this person is categorically righteous, where does such loss of compassion come from? What is it that cracks the landscape of this community? What is it that digs the chasm of indifference, wherein the rich man, the somebody, becomes the nobody, the person who is most truly blind and nameless? unable to see that which cannot be overlooked. The problem with the rich man in this story, one of the problems, is that he came to believe, I imagine, the illusion that so often ties itself on to wealth. You see, we have this tendency as humans, and it's especially strong for us in North America. We have this tendency to tell this collective story that all we need to make it in life, all that we need to overcome any obstacle, is hard work and a little bit of luck. Now, when you are poor, when you don't have a lot of resources, it is pretty easy to recognize that story as simply fantasy. All you need is a hard work and a little luck. Ha! Right. When you have no wealth, you know the truth that such words have about as much truth as a fairy tale. But then something funny happens when you do find yourself with a little bit more wealth. All you need is hard work and a little luck. Slowly those words start making a little more and more sense until we've bought into the myth hook, line, and sinker. All you need is a little hard work and a little luck. The problem, though, the difficulty is that when we believe those words, then we start to also believe that the wealth that we have is purely and solely the result of our hard work. The wealth we have, it like whispers in our ears that we rightfully deserve it. It's rightfully ours. And if someone else doesn't have it, well, then they must not have done what they needed to do in order to deserve it. And so what would be compassion, because we have now resources to share, what could be compassion because we ourselves have journeyed from the place of despair to the place of opportunity, what could be compassion turns into judgment. They clearly didn't do what they needed to do, what they needed in order to deserve it. When someone has all their needs met, you see, like the rich man, then how do we hope to understand the need of others? After all you need is hard work and a little bit of luck. And in buying into such a myth, the rich man hasn't just pushed off Lazarus into the dark corner of unseeing. If all you need is hard work and a little bit of luck, then what of grace? What of mercy? What of salvation? If we are self-sufficient, if we are the self-made woman, the self-made man, in need of nothing and no one other than our own hard work, then what becomes of God? The great chasm that separates the worlds in this story, it stands not only between Lazarus and the rich man, but between the rich man and God. So convinced of his self-sufficiency, the rich man stopped up his ears and covered his eyes so that he could no longer be witness to God's work in the world. He could no longer hear the words of Moses and the prophets. But let me say this, that chasm, it's not some great divine punishment doled out by God. All his life, the myth that wealth whispered into the ear led the rich man to isolate himself from human compassion, from human community, from an awareness of the work of God active in the world. Now, I said earlier that I don't think this parable is only about the money. I do think it is about the money, but I don't think it's only about the money. Because the reality is these chasms and the easy myths that tempt us into digging them, there are any other number of ways that we dig these chasms between ourselves and someone else, something else. When we cling so heavily to what makes us comfortable, the way that we most prefer to interact in the world, and when society or our social circles support that, and we feel good, then the chasm is dug a little bit deeper between us and others that don't worship or talk or relate or live in the same ways. Earlier this week, I was at a workshop for clergy in this Connecticut conference, and we were trying to learn something a bit about a whole host of new forms of community that have risen up in our society these days. As we look around and we lament the fact that we sit in a room that was built for a congregation that used to be much larger, and we look around and we lament that, why aren't there more of the coveted young families with kids here, or even younger than that? And let me tell you, my friends, we are not the only congregation looking around with those concerns. In fact, to be perfectly honest, we're still doing a lot better than most in these regards. But we have these concerns, and we look at the ways that folks are gathering. And folks are finding community and ways to engage in justice seeking and ways to build up wisdom and self-development in alternative ways. The fact is, it is not the case, hear this, it is not the case that people are choosing not to go to church. The thought of even going to church, so that is even something that you would do on a Sunday morning, simply doesn't even occur in the minds of a majority of people my age and younger. It's not that people are choosing against church. The thought's just not even there. My friends, that's a chasm. As we sit in wonderful buildings and do wonderful things together, and we feel good about the differences that we're trying to make in the world, and we feel good about the things that our pastor says to us from the pulpit and beside the hospital room, and we feel good about the excellent music we enjoy, there's still this chasm that stares us in the face. But my friends, the chasms are not what God wants. This chasm between the rich man and Lazarus is not some punishment by God. The chasm that we're feeling between ourselves and people who live or worship or find wisdom differently from ourselves, it's not some punishment that God is inflicting on us. God continually sends messengers across the chasm. God sent Moses and the prophets. God came to us in Jesus. And even though we supposedly wouldn't be rises from the dead, says the story, someone did rise from the dead. Jesus, the one in whom all chasms are bridged, the one in whom all relationships meet, whose passion and his compassion sees each and every one of us as we are and where we are, and loves us anyway. Now, often when this parable about the rich man and Lazarus is explored, people get all worried about which person they are in the story. This is especially true for communities like ours, made up of largely middle-class people in the wealthiest nation on earth. The truth is, though, we are neither Lazarus nor the rich man. Take comfort in that. We are not the rich man destined for the fires of Hades. Because you see, the reason I can say that with assurance is that because we, my friends, for better or for worse, have not yet reached the hereafter. Our fates are not yet sealed into eternal destiny. And that must mean, then, instead, that if there is a spot for us in this story, it is the spot of those 5 siblings, that rich man and his 5 siblings. We have the opportunity still, you see. We have the invitation still to yet find, to yet be found, to hear the testimony of Moses and the prophets, to follow the path of Jesus. Ultimately, to see the one risen and rising from the dead. In fact, we are none other than those who claim ourselves to be a people convinced by someone who rises from the dead. When we grab a hold of the power of resurrection, we grasp not only mercy and forgiveness, but we grasp a power of freedom. Not just freedom from something, but freedom for something. We are given the freedom to look at captivity and proclaim release. We are given the freedom to hear hate and sing love. We are given the freedom to stare death in the face and say life. We are given the freedom to walk out of whatever gate it is that we have locked ourselves behind, and to see the needy one lying there, waiting for us to say hello. Blessing and honor, glory and power be unto God, now and forever. Amen.